There are several types of sickness that we see demonstrated in Lost, each one differs from the other. Let's untangle their differences in order to understand what is happening in each instance. Russos Infection. The first time we hear of there being a sickness is when Rousseau tells Sayid of an infection overtaking her team in 1988 after 2 months of them being there. She claims that one by one each of her friends fell victim to it. Rousseau's account of what happened 16 years prior has long since been muddied in her memories. Upon arriving on the island, Danielle was subjected to a very sudden series of traumatic incidents that occur within 24 hours. Her close friend Nadine is murdered and her mutilated corpse is dropped atop of the group. She sees an impossible sight in the smoke monster as it pulls Montand away into the jungle and rips off his arm. Then, the Korean stranger they rescued disappears before her very eyes. And this all takes place on day 1. 2 months later, Danielle has come to believe that members of her team are afflicted with a contagious and incurable sickness. It is unclear exactly how she views the symptoms of this sickness, but she feels completely justified in outright executing anybody she deems to be symptomatic. Jin returns just in time to see that Danielle's lover Robert is next in Danielle's crosshairs. She is ready and willing to shoot him. Robert talks her down only to try and get her before she can get him. After Danielle pulls the trigger and kills her lover, she turns the gun on Jin and attempts to kill him too, accusing him of being sick because he suddenly vanished. In Chapter 10, we discuss the smoke monster's ability to infect the living, and what that really meant. It is not a literal infection in which the man in black can turn good people evil. If that were true, he would have no need to manipulate anyone in order to orchestrate his loophole. He could simply just infect islanders en masse to make them do his bidding like zombies. The infection is not metaphysical, it is metaphorical. He manipulates people, just as we saw with Benjamin Linus in Season 5.
Why do you want me to kill Jacob, John?
Because, despite your loyal service to this island, you got cancer. You had to watch your own daughter gunned down right in front of you. And your reward for those sacrifices? You were banished. And you did all this in the name of a man you'd never even met. So the question is, Ben, why the hell wouldn't you want to kill Jacob?
We are not made privy to what happened to Danielle's team between day 1 and the murder of the whole team 2 months later. All we have to explain it is Danielle's confused recounting of events 16 years on. Still, the question must be asked. If the infection is not literal, then why would Robert try to kill his pregnant girlfriend? The answer to this could be one of 2 options. The first is that the smoke monster, aka the man in black, straightaway killed those within the group who were not candidates. In the same way he immediately killed the pilot in the cockpit. Non-candidates are fair game to him. However, the rest of the group might have been protected by Jacob's touch, which means he needed to get to them another way. Perhaps he took Montand down into the hole in order to replicate him, just as he will go on to replicate Christian and Yemi. We hear Montand calling out to the team for help. But it is highly likely that he is already dead down there. This is the voice of the monster, which suggests that fake Montand might have appeared to some or all of the group in order to test them to see who would be amenable for coercion, much in the same way he tested Mr. Echo in Season 3. He is always searching for potential Jacob killers and corruptible candidates. And perhaps Robert and the other team members were the most susceptible to these corruptions. It is very telling that Danielle assumes that Jin is infected because he disappeared before her eyes. He disappeared much in the same way the smoke monster vanishes. Could it be that she saw this happen with fake Montand, or another smoke monster apparition during those 2 months? Could this be why she associates the sudden disappearance of someone with the sickness? Remember, Jin was a mysterious stranger in their midst. To Danielle, he became one of the others. Which might explain why she would later associate them with being carriers of this alleged sickness. This is why she accuses Ben of infecting her. In her warped mind, she has become unable to distinguish between an actual other on the island like Ben, a time traveler like Jin, a smoke monster manifestation like Montand, or her own lover, Robert. To her, they are all infected. And, therefore, they are all threats. This leads us comfortably onto the second possibility. That Danielle was the one who had really been infected, either through the Man in Black's manifestations and manipulations, or simply because she suffered a psychological breakdown following the traumatic events of those first 2 months on the island. There is some evidence that points to her having murdered her friends in cold blood, laboring under the delusion that they were not really themselves anymore. Robert saw what she had become capable of and understood that it was going to be him or her in the end, hence their standoff. Both parties looked dehydrated and exhausted, ready to kill one another based on fear and paranoia. How they got to this moment will always be open to fan speculation, but the one thing we can be sure of is that it is undoubtedly the handiwork of the Man in Black. He successfully played the team off against each other, doing what he has always done best. Deceive, coerce, exploit, corrupt, and kill. As we see later, Danielle Rousseau has a completely skewed memory and understanding of what the sickness actually was. In Season 2, when she suspects that baby Aaron is infected, she tells Claire in a non-too-subtle way that she will need to kill her own child. This indicates a clear and present psychosis in Rousseau. She never properly processed her own trauma. Her inaccurate diagnosis of Aaron is even more frightening when it turns out that he only had a fever that passes naturally anyway. What this proves to us, however, is that Rousseau is more than willing to kill an innocent person just because she believes they might be infected, even if it is just a baby. This is exactly how she justified the murders of her own friends 16 years ago. And it is a reminder that the smoke monster infecting people is not necessarily to be taken literally. Like Saeed says in Season 1 episode Solitary, Danielle Rousseau has been alone on this island for far too long. She is an unreliable narrator of her own story and a deeply tragic figure. The sickness that claimed her team was not an actual infectious contagion of the body. It was a sickness of the mind, an infection of the soul, a dimming of the light inside good people. Electromagnetic fallout. The DHARMA vaccine was seen on at least 2 occasions. It was shown to be a translucent yellow liquid inside a vial labeled with a familiar serial number. The vaccine appeared to be administered in most cases via a jet injector. We saw both Desmond and Kelvin injecting themselves this way. It appeared that the vaccine was originally manufactured by the DHARMA initiative, although the kit found on the pallet drop appeared to suggest they were continuing to manufacture the vaccine off-island and would send it along on pallet drops. So, what exactly was it supposed to counter against? The vaccine was most likely anti-radiation sickness medication that DHARMA workers were required to use following the incident at the Swan site in 1977, which caused electromagnetic fallout over the island. We know for a fact that this fallout affected women in pregnancy post-1977. An ironic, unintended side effect of Juliet's detonation of Jughead. The first few deaths of on-island mothers-to-be must have been incredibly demoralizing to the DHARMA initiative community. This surely led them to developing the vaccine in an attempt to counter the effects of this electromagnetic radiation. So, it follows that the 2-man team in the hatch were required to take regular shots of this medicine because they worked directly adjacent to a pocket of electromagnetism 24 hours a day. The vaccine was the only precautionary measure available to DHARMA at the time, then later it became the only line of defense available to the others. Perhaps this is the reason they continued to allow the pallet drops to take place, in order to stockpile the medicine. However, by all accounts, the vaccine was ultimately ineffective in preventing women dying during their second trimesters. This was a problem that was only eventually fixed, albeit unintentionally, by Desmond in 2004. When he turns the fail-safe key, it detonates the pocket of energy responsible for causing these pregnancy issues that have affected the island since 1977. This is also the reason why we see Ethan injecting Claire with the very same vaccine during her abduction. It remains the closest medicine that the others have to helping pregnant women bring their babies to term on the island. Both Rousseau and Claire conceived their babies off-island, and were already in the late stages upon their arrival, which is why they could give birth without suffering the same consequences. Some people believe that the vaccine was simply a placebo, but, if that were true, we would not see a physician like Ethan using it to treat Claire, who would have been incredibly valuable to the others in their attempts to solve the pregnancy crisis. For further illustration on this point, take a look at the DHARMA vaccine in this picture and consider everything just mentioned. Now let's compare it to a real-world medicine known as methotrexate. It is a chemotherapy agent and immune system suppressant used to treat cancer, autoimmune diseases, and ectopic pregnancies, and forms a translucent yellow liquid. You can decide for yourselves if there is any correlation. Time displacement. This is completely unrelated to the soul sickness that Rousseau mentions or to the electromagnetic fallout that the vaccine was intended to counter. This sickness is purely related to how people travel to and from the island. There is a time dilation barrier that surrounds the island like a bubble, or a snow globe. And there is only a very specific corridor through this bubble that people can travel through safely without suffering consequences or side effects. For the average person, traveling through the bubble can cause electrical and instrumentation failure, and confusion and disorientation. For people who have been exposed to either radiation or electromagnetism at some point in their lives, it can unstick their consciousness in time. This is known as temporal displacement, and it can be fatal, as we see happen with George Minkowski. A person's consciousness cannot fluctuate between 2 points in time without the brain eventually suffering from a cerebral hemorrhage. For Desmond and Minkowski, their minds are traveling between past and present, seemingly at random but ultimately by design. For people like Charlotte and Faraday, they are physically moving between points in time, but their brains similarly cannot function normally while in a state of temporal displacement. The common symptoms that we see include double vision, headaches and nosebleeds. Those that are afflicted from this condition might also exhibit memory loss and confusion as their consciousness flows back and forth along the river of time, which we see happen to Daniel Faraday's former girlfriend and test subject, Teresa. Even Daniel himself subjected himself to radiation exposure that caused him to suffer memory loss, hence why he didn't recall meeting Desmond in 1996 or other aspects of his past until the island began to heal him. The worst symptom is the inability to distinguish between past, present and future. Minkowski eventually succumbs to this as his brain essentially shuts down, unable to exist in more than one place and time. And we see it again with Charlotte as her mind eventually follows her body in being unstuck in time since she has been exposed to the island's electromagnetic properties the longest out of the time-traveling group. This temporal displacement of the body can be cured simply by fixing the cause of it, which is unsticking the donkey wheel. The only known cure for temporal displacement of the mind seems to be finding a constant that allows the person to differentiate between time periods. For Desmond, it was the love of his life, Penny. The cause for both of these forms of temporal displacements are directly linked to the light beneath the island. As discussed previously, the light is made up of electromagnetism and it is the source of all human consciousness. Within the source, time has no meaning. Which means your consciousness is free to flow like a river both upstream and downstream simultaneously. Desmond taps into this when he crosses the time dilation barrier. And we see him tap into it again when he glimpses the Flash sideways in Season 6. All of the mind travel and time travel is by design, in order to keep the flow of time and existence intact. So, there is a distinct difference between each of these afflictions. To summarize, the scale of humanity and morality that exists within a person can always slide into darkness and dim their inner light. Off-island, this happens every day, through negative life experiences and traumas. And the sickness grows within a person's heart, leading them to do terrible things. On island, this process can be expedited with help from the man in black, who plays on people's sense of guilt, their vulnerabilities, and their paranoid fears. He makes them believe in a lie about themselves or the people and world around them. This is the sickness that destroys Rousseau and her team. Elsewhere, the light beneath the island emits high levels of radiation, which requires a chemotherapy agent to be administered once that radiation is released at the swan site. Especially to those worst affected by the fallout, such as pregnant women. Finally, time displacement causes physical symptoms and eventually death when a person, or their consciousness, becomes unstuck from the linear flow of time. The only place our minds can survive this displacement is after death and within the source itself, where the light welcomes us home. And all forms of sickness have no dominion there. Thank you for watching. Until the next time, stay lost.